Hi, this is Poohead189, and this is the next video in my Greek city-state series. Today I'll be talking about the city of Sparta, a city-state often misunderstood by most modern scholars, and even most contemporary scholars. Many today try to pin Sparta as a Marxist, Nazi, or communist dream, take your pick. They don't take into account the anecdotes we receive or the wider contexts of what occurs in Greece close to the Spartans. They usually simply listen to sources on Sparta like Thucydides and Xenophon or even Aristotle, all of which are Athenians. And even those that do give good anecdotes like Plutarch are written hundreds of years later and only on certain individuals. Not only that, but Spartans themselves also helped in the mirage of Sparta being a simple, closed-off, backward, and even oppressive community. They wanted people, particularly their enemies, to underestimate them or think of them as dumb brutes, when in reality they were far more clever than their Athenian rivals or even the Persians gave them credit for. Today I'm going to try to sift through that mirage and see if we can find the real Sparta and what the Spartans were like. Even Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, who's probably the most unbiased source on it, wrote of Sparta almost as if it was a foreign power, much like how he wrote about Persia or Egypt. However, despite all this, nearly every source and every inscription we find that refers to Sparta comments on its great success, and most Greek cities not only hailed Sparta as the de facto leader of Greece, but saw Sparta as the ideal city-state. There were no rebellions, no corruption, no tyrants tried to take power. They protected the weaker city-states under their hegemony, and from 550 BC to 370 BC, Sparta had a flawless record on the battlefield, and was often seen as having the greatest athletes and soldiers. They lived in the Peloponnesus, which was the southern third of Greece, and within the Peloponnesus was an area called Laconia, or Lacedaemonia, which is where we get the phrase Laconic, because the Spartans spoke a dialect called Dorian, which had fewer syllables in it than other Greek dialects, and the Spartans also did not speak much either. They generally spoke very curtly. The movie 300 might be grossly inaccurate with many things, but they portrayed the Spartan personalities perfectly in my opinion, and many of the famous quotes in it was made by actual Spartans making witty remarks towards an enemy that easily outnumbered them 100 to 1. Anyway, the city had a reputation for being the best at all they set out to do, and this is because their constitution, their culture and training program, which forges an incredible civic virtue that all Spartans possess. We get a very good anecdote from Herodotus from an exiled Spartan king that found refuge in the court of Persia. The Spartan kings were held to high standards, and if they did not perform well, they were often exiled. The Spartan king Demaratus was in the company of Xerxes and his generals, the generals boasting about how many Greeks they can kill and being excited over the future invasion of Greece. Some even said that they were worth 10 Greeks, and Demaratus remained silent until Xerxes got tired of waiting and told him he wanted to see what Demaratus thought of this. I'll read as follows. Xerxes sent for Demaratus the son of Ariston, who had accompanied him in his march upon Greece, and said to him, Demaratus, I would like you to tell me something. As I hear, you are a Greek and a native of a powerful city. Tell me, will the Greeks really fight against us? I think even if all the Greeks and all the barbarians of the West were gathered together in one place, they would not be able to stop me, since they are so disunited. But I would like to know what you think about this. Demaratus replied to Xerxes' question, O king, do you really want me to give a true answer, or would you rather that I make you feel good about all this? The king commanded him to speak the plain truth, and promised that he would not on that account hold him in less favor than before. When he heard this promise, Demaratus spoke as follows, O king, since you command me to speak the truth, I will not say what will one day prove me a liar. Difficulties have at all times been present in our land, while courage is an ally whom we have gained through wisdom and strict laws. Her aid enables us to solve problems and escape being conquered. All Greeks are brave, but what I am about to say does not concern all, but only the Spartans. First, then, no matter what, the Spartans will never accept your terms. This will reduce Greece to slavery. They are sure to join battle with you even if all the rest of the Greeks surrender to you. As for Spartan numbers, do not ask how many or few they are, hoping for them to surrender, for if 1,000 of them should take the field, they will meet you in battle, and so will any other number, whether it is less than this or more. When Xerxes heard this answer of Demaratus, he laughed and answered, "What wild words, Demaratus! 1,000 men join battle with such an army as mine? Come then, will you, who were once, as you say, their king, fight alone right now against 10 men? I think not. And yet, if your fellow citizens really are as you say, then according to your laws as their king, you should be twice as tough and take on 20 all by yourself. But if you Greeks who think so highly of yourselves are simply the size and kind of men as those I have seen at my court, or as yourself, Demaratus, then your bragging is weak. Use common sense. How could 1,000 men, or 10,000, or even 50,000, particularly if they are all free and not under one lord, how could such a force stand against a united army like mine? Even if the Greeks have larger numbers than our highest estimate, we would still outnumber them 100 to 1. If they had a single master as our troops have, their obedience to him might make them courageous beyond their desire, or they might be pushed onward by the whip against an enemy which far outnumbered them. But left to their own free choice, they will surely act differently. For my part, I believe that if the Greeks had to contend with the Persians only, and the numbers were equal on both sides, the Greeks would still find it hard to stand their ground. We too have men among us as tough as those you described. Not many, perhaps, but enough. For instance, some of my bodyguard would willingly engage singly with 3 Greeks. But this you did not know, and so you talked foolishly. Demaratus answered him, I knew, O king, that if I told you the truth, I would displease you. But since you wanted the truth, I am telling you what the Spartans will do. I am not speaking out of any love that I have for Sparta. You know better than anyone how I feel about those who robbed me of my rank, or my ancestral honors, and made me a homeless exile. Look, I am no match for 10 men, or even 2, and given the choice, I would rather not fight at all. But if necessary, I would rather go against those who boast that they are a match for any 3 Greeks. The same goes for the Spartans. 1 against 1, they are as good as any. But when fighting together, they are the best soldiers in the world. For though they are free men, they are not entirely free. They accept law as their master, and they respect this master more than your subjects respect you. Whatever he commands, they do, and his command he never changes. It forbids them to flee in battle, whatever the number of their foes. He requires them to stand firm, to conquer or die. O king, if I seem to speak foolishly, I am content from this time forward to remain silent. I only spoke now because you commanded me to. I do hope that everything turns out according to your wishes. Xerxes laughed this off, thinking that this exiled king knew very little. It was during the famous stand of Thermopylae that he grew to realize how large his mistake was for not listening to Demaratus. You'll notice that he mentioned Spartans would never allow Greeks to be carried off to slavery. Athenians often get the press of being a liberal society based upon freedom, and in a way that's true. They were the first recorded democracy, and they invented it as far as we can tell. However, when Athens began to gain power and influence, their alliances to other city-states, the alliance that was formed to check Persian power called the Boeotian League, eventually turned into the Athenian Empire as Athens began to subjugate the other city-states. I often say, Sparta is better compared to early Rome than anything else, a militarized citizen body dedicated to the city-state, a free population that brought in much business and crafts, and a slave population. If that is the case, then Athens becomes the Roman mob and the corrupt Senate during the Roman civil wars. The Athenians begin to treat their allies as subjects rather than free city-states, and any that sought to disobey or leave the alliance, quote-unquote, would be besieged, and their leaders, along with many people, would be executed, all to keep the tribute coming. The Spartans, on the other hand, were the leaders of the Peloponnesian League, a system of alliances where, while they were the lead city-state, was far more loose than any Athenian policy. That is because Sparta fought for autonomia and eleutheria, meaning autonomy and freedom. Freedom for a city-state to live under its own laws and autonomy from any foreign power reigning over a Greek city-state. These words the Spartans held sacred, as they did their oaths. Oaths taken by the gods were kept sacred by most Greeks, but the Spartans were particularly bound by their promises. With their determination and willingness to uphold the freedom of their fellow Greeks, the Spartans fought the Peloponnesian War against the Athenians, but we'll speak of that another day. The point is, most Greeks, particularly lesser city-states, saw Sparta as a champion for rights and freedom. The respect Sparta had in Greece, as well as their indomitable military might, gave Sparta the de facto leadership of Greece, and they were even called upon to lead the Greek coalition forces against the Persians. As a matter of fact, the Spartans were known to be exceptional at training and leading coalition armies. Much like Rome, even Carthage called upon Spartan officers over a century after Sparta had fallen from power to train their troops to fight the rising power of Rome. The Spartans weren't only known for their armies, soldiers, and culture, but their ceramics and poetry were also highly prized. I'd almost like to think of it as you would the Norse of Iceland in the 11th century, with their skaldic poetry and their artistic crafts that honored the gods. Like them, the Spartans were deeply religious, and they held various festivals in the year where many of the men danced, some even bid to dance in full armor. Ares was celebrated as the epitome of martial virtue, but Heracles was also revered above many other gods in Sparta. The Spartans, and all Dorian-speaking Greeks, were descended from Heracles, if the chronicles are to be believed. The Dorian Greeks were said to have sacked the old kingdoms during the Bronze Age collapse and then settled in Greece to become Spartans in various smaller city-states in the Peloponnesus. Now, there are plenty of videos out there that outlines the Spartan government, but I'll speak on it a bit to give a basic overview. Sparta was an oligarchy, or a city-state that was governed by the landed classes, who were the hoplites. Sparta was very restrictive of who was and was not a citizen, and all citizens of Sparta were well off enough to be considered aristocrats in any other city-state. However, due to their culture, all of their homes and belongings, even those of their kings, were humble and, well, Spartan in nature. In fact, the city-state was not a singular city as we would like to think of it, but 5 small towns connected to one another within 2 rivers. The city-state was so humble and restrictive in accordance to citizenship during the 5th century BC that 10,000 men and their families were probably the best estimate of how many citizens there were at one time in Sparta, whereas a democracy like Athens, though to be honest, Athens also had a lot of money, so it was easy to have a huge population in Athens, but Athens was estimated to have 80,000 to 100,000 citizens and 250,000 people overall at the height of its power. You needed to own Spartan land and be reared by the city-state to be a Spartan citizen, and things were much more lax in Athens. In Sparta, you needed to own land and be reared by the city-state to be a Spartan citizen, and you needed to have graduated the intensive Spartan training program that molded Spartans into soldiers, educated men, and above all, dedicated citizens. Of course, there were men and families who did not have citizenship that lived in the greater Spartan area, called the Perioeci, or the freedmen. There were probably around 15 to 20,000 of them. The Perioeci were allowed to live and trade freely, and own land outside of Sparta. However, they could not vote in the assembly, and they owed Sparta military service and were taught the Spartan ways of war. Now I'm going to get to a topic that breeds a lot of contention among scholars, and that is concerning the helots, or helots, or slaves. I explain this in great detail in my video concerning Extra Credits history. However, I will give a brief overview here of misconceptions concerning slavery. Most modern scholars, and even some contemporary authors, treat Sparta as an oppressive city-state with huge slave population they constantly must keep under harsh control, lest they rise in rebellion and overthrow their Spartan masters. As I've explained this before in massive detail in my previous video, I'll be a bit more curt in saying that if you look at the wider context and the sources, that position is total horseshit. And with that out of the way, I will explain. The Spartans were often credited with not wishing to leave mainland Greece, because that will bring their military forces too far from Sparta and leave their slaves largely unguarded. And they fear an uprising because of their apparent large number of helots compared to their citizen population. It's the reason the scholars claim that when the Ionian cities revolted, meaning the Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor that were technically ruled by the great king of Persia, and they asked the Spartans for aid, the Spartans thought of it but then declined, whereas the Athenians accepted. They even asked the Spartan king Cleomenes a loan, and he pondered it until his daughter, who later became Leonidas' wife apparently, told him, "Make them leave," and he declined the Ionian offer, which led to the famous phrase, "It was easier convincing many men to do a dumb thing rather than just one man." The only sources that speak of Spartans brutalizing the helots are from secondary sources, or sources of men who were not of the Spartan city-state, and they also only gave vague references. which means more than likely they themselves were victims of the Spartan mirage, the mirage that the Spartans fed to others. I mean, how better to make someone underestimate your city-state than to make them believe that you were afraid of your own slaves? Herodotus, as I said, probably the most unbiased and definitely the most well-traveled source, makes little mention of any slave-fearing or slave brutality, and instead gives anecdotes of what is most likely the true reason the Spartans did not wish to travel far from Sparta, and that was because of their two strongest contenders in mainland Greece, other than Athens. The Thebans from Thebes, who were usually Spartan allies in the fight with Sparta against Athens in the Peloponnesian War, and the city of Argos, whose main state policy is hatred of Sparta for taking over the land that used to be theirs. Both were great land powers, particularly Thebes, second only to Sparta in land-based military, and they both also capitulated and gave their support to the Persians, as did many other Greek city-states, fearing annihilation. Sparta was always the greatest land power in Greece. However, they weren't stupid, as I said. They had too many rivals close to them to travel far off with their main army. However, you will notice that during the Persian Wars, Sparta did not wish to travel overseas. However, after Sparta defeated Athens and gained their hegemony not only over the Peloponnesus, but all of Greece, and they had no further rivals, they had no problems crossing the Ionian Sea and attacking Persia. The only factors that changed then were the strength of their rivals. You know what did not change? The numbers of their army or the strength of their slaves. The slaves were a non-issue. And before I forget, the Helots were also not state-owned slaves, but private ones. And most Greek city-states had slaves, and many had the amount Sparta reputedly had and did not fear travel outside of their zones. And it is also something to note that Helots were sometimes called to fight in war as well, so that means that they did not need to keep their slaves at home at all times. Back to the overview of Sparta's government. They voted by assembly, as most Greek city-states did, meaning that all males fit for military service could vote. However, unlike the Athenians, the Spartan assembly was rarely called to vote. They didn't enjoy a good debate like the Athenians did. Voting was a yes or no issue, and only during great duress would anyone get up to speak to sway others. Most of the discussion was done in the Gerousia, which was a council of the 28 elders of Spartan society, each having a vote to decide Spartan policy. The Spartans, as I mentioned, also still had kings, something almost every city-state had outlawed by then. There were two kings, both apparently descended directly from Heracles after the Trojan War. Both lines were pure and unbroken. The Agiad line, which was considered the senior, and the junior Eurypontid line. The two kings were often at odds with one another whenever they ruled together, but as history would have it, for most of recorded history, there was usually only one major king in Sparta. The other line's king was usually either exiled or dead and their heir was too young to rule. The kings did not serve as traditional monarchs, however. Instead, they were the commanders of the army and the high priests at religious festivals. They ruled by charisma and force of will. They were leaders, and I am not remiss to say that more often than not, a Spartan king usually did fit the ideal of a true leader. Most kings did not lead by example, and instead ruled from grand palaces or were pampered on campaign. The Spartan kings were considered kingly because they were the ideal citizen, exemplifying the ideals of the city-state through example. Other than being able to lead in battle and religious rites, their only real perk was that they also had votes on the council with the other Spartan elders, meaning there were 30 votes in all. There were also 5 ephors, or officials, elected annually to oversee Spartan affairs and make sure the constitution was being run smoothly. Some scholars claim they also dictated foreign policy, but we do not know that for sure. As you can see over the course of what I've said, the Spartan society was not as oppressive and backward as most think. However, it was conservative and traditional. These aspects, along with Sparta's impeccable military record and the power of their state, bred a certain arrogance in Spartans. Not great arrogance, and the Athenians were in some ways even more prideful in their power. However, if there was a flaw of living under the Spartan way of life, it was a lack of guidance when outside of Spartan influence. Spartans in small numbers were known to go berserk when left to their own devices in decadent cities like Corinth and Ephesus. Either a Spartan would get the taste of the good life and overindulge in pleasures that the rigid Spartan system wouldn't allow, or more likely, they would see such decadence as weakness and would often fight and perhaps kill men during parties, and nothing is worse than a raging Spartan. They were impeccable as the hoplite phalanx, but they were also feared single warriors in combat from what we can tell through the anecdotes. One thinks of Thermopylae that when the fighting grew so fierce, the Spartan hoplites lost their cohesion and the fighting became too close for spears, and they began killing Persians with their swords, which is impressive because Greeks never really used swords in combat, much less used them as effectively like the Spartans did. After the Peloponnesian War ended in 404 BC, at the height of Sparta's power, they had the hegemony over all of Greece, and invaded Asia Minor to liberate the Ionian cities of Greece, and the Persians were so scared of the Spartans, instead of fighting them, they sent diplomats over to Greece and orchestrated the other Greek city-states to attack Sparta from the rear. This led to what we know as the Corinthian War, and Sparta found itself facing the armies of Athens, Corinth, Thebes, and Argos, and even with their combined might, the best they could pull off against Sparta was a draw. However, to contrast, the Spartan decline occurred in 370 BC at the Battle of Leuctra, and it was at the hands of the Thebans, whom they had defeated dozens of times before and were also allies during the Peloponnesian War, as I said, not at the hands of the Athenians. The Spartans had just lost their greatest king in several generations, King Agesilaus II, who had led the attack on Persia, and who fought in the Corinthian War, and they were now without a charismatic monarch. Their power was also overextended, so it was at an all-time low. Meanwhile, the Thebans' power was at its height, because they had copied a lot of the Spartan institutions in order to gain military strength. And they had also formed a league of their own, the Boeotian League. For the first time in over a century, the Spartans were decisively defeated in a land battle, and Thebes took over the Spartan hegemony of most of Greece. However, it was a very short-lived hegemony. A mere generation later, Macedon in the north rose to power, and at Chaeronea, Philip II would crush the alliance of Thebes and Athens and conquer Greece. Conquer all but Sparta, in the extreme south of the Peloponnesus. For even after losing domination over Greece, and without a great king, the Spartans alone stood defiant against the Macedonians. They led rebellions against Macedon, and even centuries later will be popular in training armies across the Mediterranean. I will now finish this lecture by reading two of the first anecdotes I had ever heard of Spartans, even before I even read the primary sources. They had been used by the teaching company to showcase Sparta, and they spoke volumes to me on Spartan ways of life. One was written by Thucydides, the author of the History of the Peloponnesian War, and the next is by Plutarch, the famous 2nd century biographer of Rome and Greece. Thucydides writes, "If all the people were to disappear from Sparta and centuries later someone were to enter the city-state, that man would never have believed that Sparta wielded the great power that it did. On the other hand, if the same thing were to happen to Athens, if it was abandoned and one were to walk through it, you would probably consider it twice as powerful as it actually had been. For as Athens made great monuments for its people, the great monuments of Sparta were its people." That last part was something that I made up. That was not Thucydides. And finally, a quaint anecdote from Plutarch. During the Olympic Games, where different athletes from across Greece competed for their honor and the honor of their city-state, an old man came into the arena and began walking down the stairs in the stadium, looking for a seat. As he walked and searched, the Greeks around him glanced at him awkwardly and guiltily, each of them thinking the same uncomfortable thing. As the elder made it to the bottom of the stairs, he came across a group of Spartan youths and their trainer, and when they noticed the old man, every one of the Spartan youths got up and offered him their seat. And Plutarch states, "Every Greek knew what was right to do, but only the Spartans did it." I reiterate what I've stated. Through its training systems, its military might, its leaders, and the Spartan constitution that bred a civic virtue beyond compare, not only was Sparta considered the quintessential city-state, but in my personal opinion,